Good morning, everyone. I've been asked to talk about research on meditation, which is something I've been tracking and involved in for quite some time, one of my favorite subjects. Last night, I was fortunate enough to spend some time with Sokni Rinpoche and Sogyo Rinpoche, and I was remembering the first time I met Sogyo Rinpoche, which was in around about 1976, 77, when he was in New York translating for the great master Dudjom Rinpoche. And I was struck by how, thinking back, how totally clueless I was about what someone like Sogyo Rinpoche or Dudjom Rinpoche actually had to offer. By then I had finished my studies in psychology and I was working at a magazine. I was already in journalism. And Sogyo Rinpoche and I had lunch. And he was telling me that he was thinking of writing a book. And would I maybe want to help him with the book? It was on something like death and dying or something, you know. I took a pass at the time. And then I also went to see Dudjom Rinpoche, who was, is I'm sure you know, one of the most amazing masters of the age. And looking back, I realized it was as though someone had offered me, any wish that I could hope for, and I had chosen to ask for them to recommend a good Mexican restaurant. It just completely went by me. So, let me tell you about an experiment that was done. It's a classic in social psychology. It was at the Princeton Theological Seminary with divinity students. These are Christian divinity students, and they were told that they were going to be rated on a practice sermon. And they would be given a topic to prepare on. And then after a bit of time, they go over to another building and give the sermon and get the rating. And half of them were given as the topic the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped to help the stranger in need by the side of the road. And the other half were given random subjects from the Bible. And each of them has time to prepare, and then one by one they go over to the other building. As each of them goes to the other building, at a certain point, they pass a man who's bent over in pain and moaning. And the question is, do they stop to help the stranger in need? The really interesting question is, does it matter if you're thinking about the Good Samaritan when you encounter the stranger? Bottom line, made no difference at all. What mattered was how much time pressure they felt they were under. If they felt that they were late, there was no way they would stop. And this is a little bit the story of our lives. We have endless opportunities in life to help people in some way. And how many of them do we just let go by, and how many do we act on? I bring that up because at the time, in psychology, the prevalent view of a compassionate act, of altruism, was that there was always a selfish motive, that there's always something in it for me. And the notion that there's a spectrum, a natural spectrum from being totally self-absorbed, and just preoccupied with our own thoughts, our own to-do list, and so on, to actually noticing the other person, and then having noticed, to tune into the person and empathize. And then if we sense a need, to have some concern, and then if we're concerned, to actually act to help them. That whole spectrum was kind of ignored in psychology. And the contrast was brought home to me when I had an opportunity as a graduate student to go to India for a year and a half. And I was able to meet some really great masters while I was there. And one of them was a very humble Lama named Kunu Rinpoche. Kunu Rinpoche lived in Bodh Gaya, and he had a simple room and a constant stream of visitors, day and night, people coming to see him, and he was always welcoming of anybody at any time. And what I didn't know about Kunu Rinpoche was that he was also the Dalai Lama's main tutor on Shantideva. Can you imagine being the teacher of the Dalai Lama on compassion? I mean, he was really somebody. He was revered by all of the major lineages. He'd been offered a suite of rooms at the top of the monastery and an attendant, but he just chose to have this simple monk's room and be continually available. What struck me was the contrast with my own professors back in graduate school at Harvard, who, as opposed to having, being completely welcome, they had something called office hours, when you could make an appointment to see them. And I was just, at that time, so struck by the difference in the quality of being between someone like Kunu Rinpoche and, the most famous psychologists of the day, who were, available by office hour. So I tried to bring some of this back into psychology. I did my dissertation on the effects of meditation on stress. And I had people do a simple mantra meditation and then showed them a film that was made by the Canadian Woodworking Association to get woodworkers to use their safety devices. And in the film, there are 3 accidents. And each one is a kind of little morality play, because the accident occurs because the worker didn't use their safety device. So the first accident goes like this. Mac is operating a gigantic circle saw with very vicious looking teeth, and he's feeding a big piece of plywood into it, and he's talking to his friend Joe. And Mac hasn't put the safety device on that circle saw, so you see his thumb is heading for the saw, but he doesn't notice because he's talking to Joe. And it gets set up the way they build suspense in a horror movie, where you hear the breath and you can see something is around the corner, you don't know what it is. So you see, they pan to the saw and the thumb, and there's Mac talking to Joe. And then the saw and the thumb's getting closer, and Mac's talking to Joe. It's getting closer and closer. And I could tell when the thumb hit the saw by watching the readout of the people's heart rate and sweat response and so on in the control room where I was, because it would go higher and higher and higher, and then it would peak, and then it would go down. And what was interesting was if someone had meditated before they saw that, it wasn't as though they had no reaction, but their recovery from that reaction was much, much quicker than people who hadn't meditated. And if you were a more advanced meditator, the effect was even bigger. So this was a first clue for some of us that there was something going on here with this stuff called meditation that might be interesting. However, at the time I was in a clinical psychology program, and my professors just didn't get why I was bothering with this meditation stuff. I remember clinical professors saying, I was explaining what a mantra was, that you repeat this word in your mind, and he said, well, how is that different from my patients with obsessive compulsive disorder? And I could tell the kind of, subliminal, the hidden agenda was if he was looking at me, he's thinking, are you psychotic? That was kind of the atmosphere in psychology. Back in the day when we first started doing this. But my friend in graduate school is a guy named Richard Davidson. Unlike me, I became a journalist. He stayed in psychology. And he also was really interested in studying meditation. And years later, he became a leader in what's called affective neuroscience. It's the study of emotion in the brain. And one of the first things he discovered was that we have an emotional set point, and it can be, there's a kind of barometer for it. When we're in a very distressed state, really bummed out, upset, agitated, there's a lot of activation in the right prefrontal area and the amygdala. It's an amygdala hijack. The amygdala is upset, and it's captured the prefrontal zone and is driving it. That's when we're upset. When we're feeling good, on the other hand, we're having a great day, I feel energy, enthusiastic, I could do anything. Those areas are quiet, and the activity is very high on the left prefrontal area. And it turns out that each of us has a resting ratio of left to right activation, which predicts our mood range very accurately day to day. So it's like a bell curve. You know, for IQ, most people are in the middle, and then there tapers out to the extremes. There's a bell curve for the set point, he discovered. People who are very far to the left, you know, never have a bad day, or if they get upset, they shake it off right away. People who are very far to the right might be clinically depressed or clinically anxious. So the way he discovered this was by having hundreds and hundreds of people come into the lab and measuring them. And as it happened, he was at the University of Wisconsin. A Geshe came to town. He thought, oh, it'd be interesting. I'll ask the Geshe to come in the lab. So he measured this Geshe set point, and he was what's called 2 standard deviations further out to the left than anyone he'd ever seen. This guy was in such a good state. It was off the charts, literally. What was funny about that was that he later had the opportunity to present this data to the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama said, oh, I know that Geshe. He's the abbot of a monastery. I don't think he's such a good practitioner, actually. So that got us really interested in studying really good practitioners. But one of the things that's become clear in the emerging dialogue, which is now quite active between Western neuroscience and psychology and contemplatives, is the difference in perspective on the mind and the power of the Buddhist analysis. I once was moderating a meeting of what's the Mind and Life Institute, which brings together groups of scientists with the Dalai Lama, and this was on the topic of destructive emotions. And the Western psychologists had arrived at a definition of destructive emotions, which was that it's not that any emotion per se is destructive, but when they make us do things which are harmful to ourselves or harmful to other people, then they become destructive. And the Dalai Lama said, well, you know, from the Buddhist point of view, we look at it a little differently. We would say an emotion is destructive if it distorts your perception of reality and disturbs your inner equilibrium. Well, that's a much more subtle analysis of the mind. And what's becoming clearer and clearer is that the West has a huge amount to learn about the mind and the subtleties of the mind and the potentials of the mind from Buddhist psychology. There's started to be a field emerging called contemplative neuroscience, which is the collaboration between contemplative practitioners and neuroscientists to study how these practices actually affect the brain. One of the first studies in contemplative neuroscience was done in a biotech startup with a method called mindfulness as taught by Jon Kabat-Zinn. How many people here are familiar with Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness? Yeah, it's become quite widespread. And you know, he has a kind of 8-week format. And he started using it. I knew Johnny when I was in graduate school. And I remember when he told us that he was going to take a job at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and that he was going to teach mindfulness to the people that medicine couldn't help anymore. Chronic patients who were just managing diseases like diabetes or arthritis, chronic pain conditions, and so on. And that they had given him a little room in the cellar to do this. And we thought, okay, we'll never hear from Johnny again. This is the end of his career. But what happened, of course, was that the mindfulness itself didn't cure anything, but it made the quality of life immeasurably better for patients and did relieve a number of symptoms. And now it's become integrated with cognitive therapy. It's become a very hot field. So Richie and Johnny teamed up, and they went to a high-tech, a biotech startup, and Johnny taught mindfulness to people there, and Richie measured the brains and other things. And what he found was that at the beginning, these people were pretty hassled, and their brain was tilted to the right on that set point. After 8 weeks, they had started to tilt back to the left. That was news. You could change the emotional set point using contemplative practice. The other thing which was interesting was that instead of feeling stressed out all the time, they're remembering what they loved about their work. They're enthusiastic again. And another interesting thing was that they happened to have given them the flu shot. And the flu shots help different people to different extents, depending on how well your body can do something called mobilizing the antibody titers. That is, make use of how well your immune system can make use of the vaccine. What they found was the people who had done the mindfulness had a much more robust immune function compared to control group. And that's another thing that started to emerge, is that the changes aren't just in the brain, they're in the immune system. There was a study just done with students of Mingyur Rinpoche, kind of mid-level students, not beginners, but people who have been practitioners for many years, who are asked to do a one-day retreat, and they're measured before and after. And one of the first findings from that was that a measure of the inflammation in the body, which is a general monitor of inflammatory response, it went way, way down just from one-day practice. Now, for me, the most interesting question is, what accounts for the qualities of the great, great, great masters? And by this I mean someone like Dujam Rinpoche, or people like Tukul Urgyen, Sokni Rinpoche's father, or his Tukul Urgyen's father, or his grandmother. There's a wonderful book called Blazing Splendor. I really recommend it. Blazing Splendor is Tukul Urgyen's memoir about great masters that he met in Tibet. And this is a generation where Sokni Rinpoche calls them antique masters. These are people who routinely would do 20 years or more of retreat over the course of their life. And we understand now that has, from a neuroscience point of view, enormous ramifications because of what's called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the understanding, I don't know if you once learned that we're born with a large amount of neurons and we slowly lose them until we die. Did you ever hear that? Yeah, well, it turns out that's a piece of neuromythology. Not true. Actually, the brain makes 10,000 new neurons every day of our lives. And from stem cells, and they migrate to where they're needed. And once they get there, over the next 4 months, they form 10,000 connections, and then they're in place. So the brain is continually reshaping itself. That's the plasticity part. And any systematic training reshapes the brain. Professional violinists, they discovered, have very large areas for their thumbs and fingers of their bow hand because of the practice. They did a study of people starting to drive cabs in London. And I don't know if you've been to London, but the streets were laid out by cow paths, following cow paths. They make no sense at all. It's like Boston that way. So what they found was that over 6 months, the spatial cortex, the part of the brain that maps territory, became enlarged. in cabbies. And this is basically the lesson of neuroplasticity, is the more you practice something, the stronger the brain connectivity for that becomes and the larger the area devoted to it. So if you think about someone with 20 years of practice or 25 years of practice, it's an enormous amount of time. And this is where contemplative neuroscience is going. But the qualities of great masters seem to be not just because of taking vows, but because it becomes ingrained in the brain. This is who you are. And I don't know if you've noticed, but if one of these great masters is requested to teach, the first thing they'll say is, "I don't know anything about this." The humility is enormous. But then they'll probably go on to say, "But I was lucky enough to study with someone who knew something," and then they'll teach. There's a story in Blazing Splendor I love. Two really renowned Kempos, who are wonderful scholars, come to a monastery, and they're requested to teach. And the first Kempo says, "Oh, I don't know anything about this." And then he says, "And he doesn't know anything either." That's spontaneous humility. I remember I happened to be in Newport Beach in 1989, the day the Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize. And as it happened, I had an appointment to bring a friend of mine to have tea with His Holiness. And we had tea, and His Holiness was very interested in my friend, inquiring all about him and so on. And we found out later that morning he'd found out he'd won the Nobel Prize. He didn't mention it. And at the news conference the next day, where, it was a room full like this, everybody, paparazzi, it was like strobe lights, they're taking so many pictures. The first question he's asked is, "Well, how do you feel having won the Nobel Peace Prize?" And he thinks and he says, "Well, I feel happy." And, we think, yeah, I would feel happy too. And then he finishes the sentence, "I feel happy for my friends who wanted me to win this prize." That's what you call mudita, taking joy in the joy of others. It was amazing teaching. And Tara and I were fortunate enough to spend a little time with the help of Sogni Rinpoche, with one of the great masters, Adi Rinpoche. And at one point he was telling us about how he had been in a terrible Chinese prison for many, many years, maybe 17 years, and gone through torture and so on. And how he never got angry at any of his captors because he felt such compassion for them and for the terrible karmic predicament that they were in and all the negative karma they were building up by having to do these things. Is that right? Yeah. So how does someone become like that? And what is going on from a Western science point of view? In that meeting with the Dalai Lama, at one point he posed a challenge to the scientists he was talking to. He said, "When it comes to handling destructive emotions, Buddhism has many, many methods that have been proven over centuries. What I urge you to do is take those methods outside of the context of Buddhism, study them in the laboratory as rigorously as you can, and if you validate them, if they do help people, then spread them as widely as you can outside Buddhism." He said, if there are benefits to people, why should it be just for Buddhists? So this was the real beginning of what has become a very strong movement in neuroscience and psychology, to do very rigorous studies of contemplative practice. And because His Holiness has been involved from the start, they've been very lucky to be able to get very high-level practitioners to come into the lab. And these are world-class people. They've done between 10,000 and 55,000 lifetime hours of practice. I think, I can't remember the math, but I think if you do a 3-year retreat, it's somewhere around 10,000 hours. But this goes up to 55,000 hours. So highly experienced, highly seasoned practitioners are genuine collaborators. The old model of science studying something is, well, we're the scientists and we know what we want to look at. So you come in and we'll do what we want and see what we get. But the scientists involved in this have a more collaborative attitude. They realize they really don't know much about meditation. So they need to ask the practitioners, what should we study? What are you going to do? What will happen? What might we find? The first practitioner who I saw as a collaborator was Matthew Ricard, whom some of you may know, who for many years was Khyentse Rinpoche, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's attendant, and who spent a lot of time practicing himself. But Matthew, you may not be aware, also has a PhD in biology from Pasteur Institute. He's a top-level scientific thinker and a practitioner. So they were doing the dry run with Matthew, and they had decided to study 4 particular meditation methods. One was concentration, one was visualization, one was compassion, generating compassion, and one was what Matthew called open presence, which is on the continuum of practices that are being taught here. And because they needed to do this very rigorously, they put him in an MRI. Anybody had an MRI here? An MRI, if you haven't had it, is a giant magnet. It's a magnet about as big as this stage and about as high. And they insert you in a slot, kind of like a human cigar case, put inside this magnet, and it whirs around you. It's very noisy. If you ever saw the movie, the David Lynch movie Eraserhead, it's a little like the soundtrack for Eraserhead, but 10 times louder. And I don't know about you, but my optimal model of where I like to meditate is not very much like an MRI machine. It has more to do with a nice chair and a cup of coffee and quiet. So first of all, you're in the MRI. And second of all, they're going to ask you to do this particular meditation, like concentration or open presence, for exactly 90 seconds. And between those 90-second periods, there's going to be a 60-second rest period. And they're going to announce them to you by a little buzzer. And so the first sessions, and they want you to do it 6 times for each. So imagine for 60 seconds you're at rest, and then, okay, 90 seconds visualization, 60 seconds, for 6 repetitions. Not only that, not only was there 4 conditions, 4 different meditations of this, they had some computer glitches. So Matthew ended up in the MRI for 3 hours. Usually in a hospital, you're in there for maybe a half hour, 45 minutes. So we all, at the end, you know, when Matthew was taken out of the cigar tube, we wanted to see, is this guy fried or what? And he gets up and he's smiling and he says, oh, that was like a mini retreat. That was so nice. That's the difference between practitioners and non-practitioners. So what do they find? They're starting to analyze. This is an enormous amount of data. And one of the first papers to be published was on the compassion condition. And they, because it's a scientific study, they also recruited a group of what are called controls. Controls are people who, in this case, are, in almost every case, I'm going to come clean as a psychologist, almost always a control group is college sophomores who are taking an introductory psych course and need extra credit by being in a psych. So these poor college sophomores were taught the same compassion meditation as the practitioners were doing, and they were put in the MRI too, and they did it. And what they found was that the right prefrontal cortex, the left prefrontal cortex, the zone for positive emotion, became very active during the compassion meditation, along with several other areas. And in the sophomores, it became 10% more active than at rest. However, in the practitioners, the expert adepts, it became 100% more active on average, much, much bigger. And in a couple of them, it became 700 to 800% more active, which was astounding, because the idea that one could voluntarily activate a selective part of the brain at that level, at that magnitude, was unimaginable in neuroscience, but that's what was found. I should say that Mingyur Rinpoche was one of the expert subjects. He's written about that, and they sometimes call him the happiest man in the world. I don't know if he is the happiest man in the world, but he's really happy. I remember once Tara and I were going to meet with him in New York City, and Tashi, I don't know if you were staying with him or not, but he was staying in a kind of a cheap hotel in town, and we called him up. And I called him up, and he said, "Oh, I just got out of the shower," and then he mentioned, "We haven't had any hot water for 3 days." It was the first shower, and you know, if I hadn't had any hot water for 3 days, I'd be a little grumpy. He was laughing and laughing and laughing about it, and that's that left prefrontal cortex. So some of the other early findings, and by now there's really a continual wave of them. This was done with Matthew. There's something called the startle reflex. If you hear something really sudden, your autonomic nervous system startles. And the stronger your startle response and the longer it lasts, the more emotionally reactive you are, generally. So it's a quick index of emotional reactivity. And the way they test the startle response is by firing a gun. It's a blank, unexpectedly, while you're wired up. So they brought Matthew in, and everybody has a startle response. And they fired the gun, and Matthew didn't startle. That's what you call equanimity in the texts. They've also been doing tests on pain thresholds. There's something called a blister test, where they have a device which blisters your skin. It's very painful. And it's a way of accurately assessing a pain threshold. You know, tell us when it hurts. And what they found with expert practitioners is it doesn't hurt. The pain threshold is very, very high, which suggests that these changes include brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, probably there, endorphins and opioids and so on, which is numbers. Another interesting finding was by a psychologist named Paul Ekman. Paul Ekman is famous as the world expert on the facial expression of emotion. You know, the faces is one of the most vivid emotion channels. And Paul actually got a federal grant to spend 1 year staring in a mirror, learning to voluntarily control the 200 muscles of the face, many of which were thought not to be within voluntary control. Once he did this, he then figured out for every major emotion a logarithm of what your face does when you're happy, when you're sad, when you're angry, when you're disgusted. And he did it in terms of formula. Well, this muscle does that, and this muscle does that, and this muscle does that. So Paul is a superb sensor of emotion. I remember once I was walking down the street with him I was going to conduct a meeting that he was going to be in, but he was telling me about his discovery of what are called micro-expressions. Micro-expressions occur very quickly, within a 20th of a second, just a quick little twitch of the face. But they're very important because they reveal what you're actually feeling at that moment, no matter what you're trying to make the person you're with feel. So they're honest expressions of emotion, they're automatic, and they're unconscious. We don't know we're making them. And luckily he finds most people are very bad at reading them. We're no better than chance at reading them. So he's telling me this, and he says, but I developed a training where people can get better at it. Just then, we're getting to the meeting, and I'm thinking, this is really interesting, but I hope he wraps up, because I've got to run this meeting, I've got to think about that. And just then he says, and if someone had taken the training, they'd know you're getting a little angry with me right now. This guy is really dangerous. There's a TV show based on him called Lie to Me, which is about Paul Ekman, actually, and is written by Paul Ekman. It's a guy who solves crimes using this skill. So Paul Ekman wanted to study Matthew, and Paul was interested in what the impact of having a negative confrontation with someone who was so positive would be. So he used a paradigm that's classic in marital research, where a couple comes into a lab at the end of the day, and their face is videoed so they can read the expressions, and their heart rate and so on is monitored. And they have a discussion, a neutral discussion, how was your day, dear? Then they have a discussion about something they disagree about. It's like a little micro-fight in the lab. And on the basis of this, the guy who developed it, John Gottman, has discovered a pattern that predicts whether a couple will divorce. It's a very powerful indicator. Paul wanted to use the same methodology. But Matthew was a monk, so he couldn't, have his wife come in. That's not going to work. So that he decided to recruit the most difficult confrontational professor at the university. And he did a kind of under-the-radar phone survey of, who would you nominate? Oddly enough, everybody agreed who that would be. So they call this professor and say, in the interest of science, would you participate in the study? And of course he says yes. But as the day started to come nearer and nearer, he started to make demands that became more and more, out of the question. So they dumped the worst, most confrontational. They went with the second most confrontational guy. And the professor comes in, and they're going to have a debate. And it's on the premise that this professor, who has a very cushy, tenured position, should do what Matthew had done, give up his job and go to a hermitage and meditate for the rest of his life. That's the point they're going to discuss. So they put on the sensors and so on. And from the beginning, the professor's really upset and agitated. Matthew, perfectly calm. Then they start the discussion. Matthew stays perfectly calm. The professor gets calmer and calmer and calmer. By the end of 15 minutes, he's having such a delightful time, he doesn't want to stop talking. So, there's this new field, social neuroscience, which is the discovery of what happens when you look at two brains during an interaction instead of just one brain in one person, which was the classic paradigm in neuroscience. And it turns out that opened the way to discovering massive circuitry in the newer part of the brain, particularly the forebrain, which is designed to lock into the other person's brain. The big discovery was what are called mirror neurons. They're discovered in an interesting way. They're monitoring in a lab in Italy the motor cortex of a monkey, and neuron by neuron, and they're looking at the activity of one neuron which didn't do anything except when the monkey lifted its arm. Then it fired. Then it became active. Only time. And then one day, the monkey wasn't moving and that neuron was firing. They didn't know what was going on. Then they realized what was happening. it was a hot day, a lab assistant had gone out to get a gelato, and he was standing there in front of the monkey, and every time he raised his hand to take a lick, the monkey's neuron for doing the same thing fired. Those are mirror neurons. They're like a neural Wi-Fi. When we're with someone else, they lock into the person we're with, and they activate in our brain what that person is doing, what they're feeling, what they're intending. And this is just one part of the social circuitry of the brain, which creates a emotional channel, a subterranean channel. No matter what else we're doing, in every interaction we pass emotions back and forth. So Matthew was passing positive emotions. And the question is, are we going to be a sender or a receiver? And what are we sending and what are we receiving? I remember years ago, I was taking a bus up Madison Avenue on a very hot August day, very steamy, very humid. It's the kind of day when people in the city are a little irritable, a little prickly, and you have this invisible bubble around you, like, don't talk to me, don't touch me. And I was standing waiting for the bus with this bubble, and the bus pulls up, and I get on with my bubble intact, and the bus driver did something really alarming. He spoke to me. He actually, it wasn't just, hey, it was, oh, how's your day been? I was a little startled, but I sat down with my bubble. And then I realized this bus driver is carrying on a conversation with everybody on the bus. Oh, you're looking for suits, are you? Well, there's a great sale up here on the right. And did you hear about the movie in the Cineplex? I know the one in Cinema 6 got great reviews, but I saw the one in Cinema 4 last night. It's fantastic. You should see it. And then, did you hear about the Matisse exhibit up here? On and on and on. People would get off that bus and he'd say, I hope your day's going to be wonderful. And they'd say, yeah, thank you. He'd transform people during that bus ride through this circuitry. That guy was an urban saint. He was sending ripples of good feeling through a city that sorely needed. But as practitioners, the question to ask ourselves is, no matter what we're doing and no matter with whom, can we be stealth bodhisattvas? Okay. I think I'll end there. So thank you very much.